Thanks very much, and I just want to say thanks to Joe for organising all the Irish end of this, and then everyone here pulling this together. It's really amazing, and it's great to be here. We're going to be talking about, I suppose, a pretty contentious, the most contentious event in modern Irish history, which is the Great Famine of the 1840s. And I suppose what I'm going to try and do is look at, not really who's responsible. In my mind, there's no question the British government bears the responsibility. The question is what they're responsible for. So that's what we're going to try and pick apart in this, and with the question of famine or genocide. And a good place to start is with a quote from Benjamin Jowett, the master of Balliol College in the late 19th century. And he famously or infamously said, "I've always felt a horror of political economists since I heard one of them say that he feared that the famine of 1848 in Ireland would not kill more than 1 million, and that would scarcely be enough to do much good." And I think this is a really useful comment. I should say he's talking about the economist Nassau Senior, who was a British government advisor in the 1840s and a kind of an ideologue in Britain at the time. And I think it's a really good place to start. It kind of cuts to the heart to some of the stuff we're going to talk about. It highlights the callous nature of British politics in the 1840s, that they're weighing up debt on this scale. It also gets across the enormity of the event that we're going to talk about, the reference there to 1 million dead. And there was 1 million people died between 1845 and 1851, and probably more afterwards, although it's very hard to say how many. So what I'm going to do is look exactly what happened and why. But before we do that, we need to get a sense of what Ireland was like on the eve of the famine in 1845. It's a pretty different society than comes after it. It's a pretty different Ireland, obviously, than it is today, but it was also very different from Britain at the time as well. Then we'll look at the British government response. But look, we'll get into it. And we'll start with Ireland in 1845. So some of this might seem very basic to people, but I am going to kind of just spell out, because I think there can be confusion over some of this stuff. So all of Ireland, all 32 counties, was part of the United Kingdom in 1845. The government in London ruled every county in Ireland directly. That meant that somewhere like Cambridge and Kerry were theoretically, at least under the British government, exactly the same and would be treated the same. They weren't, but that was the legal or the political framework which the famine takes place in. And this came into effect under something called the Act of Union, which was passed in 1801, and came into effect the following year passed in 1800, it came into effect the following year of 1801, and the Act of Union brought Ireland into the Union of Britain, Scotland, or England, Scotland rather, and Wales at the time. This was supposed to be a new chapter for Ireland moving into the 19th century. The 1798 rebellion was the largest insurrection in modern Irish history. It had ended in a defeat for the Republican movement. The British government claimed this is going to be a new start in many ways for Ireland, that Ireland would become a sister kingdom to England, Scotland, and Wales. The Act of Union is an unmitigated disaster for Ireland. It accelerates a decline that's already underway in the Irish economy. The idea that Ireland was a sister kingdom was a joke, really. No one in Britain believed this. Tariffs, the Irish economy had to be protected in 1800 from a more advanced British economy in places developing in places like Manchester. Dublin did have an emerging industrial sector, and under the terms of the Act of Union, this was going to be protected. However, the British Free Trade Lobby, which played a really important part in this story, lobbied to get them removed 20 years too early, so the final tariffs are removed in 1824, and that basically finishes off the Irish economy. A couple of other things to say. The majority of the Irish population at this point are Catholics, about 80% of the population, and they're, in 1800, officially second-class citizens. The pledge that they're going to be made equal isn't brought into effect until 1829. That had been a promise of the Act of Union. And this just highlights the unequal nature between Ireland and Britain. Maybe a good way to summarise this is, I suppose, a quote of the Duke of Wellington. And he said, "Being born in a stable does not make one a horse." He was born in Dublin. And that reflects the view of the British ruling class at the time about how Irish people were viewed. And to a certain extent, they actually viewed all Irish people, Catholics, Protestants, rich and poor. There was a view that the Irish could not be trusted. There was a view that things that happened in Ireland were exaggerated. There was a view that that Irish people tended to exaggerate their problems and were ultimately the architects of their own problems. like the people who suffer most under this are Irish Catholics. They're the in many ways considered kind of a bogeyman in British politics. In terms of a population, it's very important to understand this. We're going to talk a lot about numbers. The population of Ireland in 1845 was 8.14 million technically. Or the reason I say technically is there had been a census in 1841 that calculated the population of Ireland at 8.14 million. It had probably grown close to about 9 million on the eve of the famine. The census underestimated the numbers by about 200,000 or 300,000, and there is further growth. So we're talking about 8.5 to 9 million people. Interestingly, Ireland today has a population about a tenth the size of Britain. In 1845, you can see Ireland has a population of 8 million, Britain has a population of 16 million. And even so, Ireland has a much higher population density than Britain at the time. And this is also very important in terms of the story. However, I will stress, and something you read a lot, Ireland was not overpopulated at the time. Ireland was producing, as I'm going to go into, about enough food to feed 2 million people in British cities in 1845. So if you read online, the cause of the Great Famine is overpopulation. That really doesn't hold true if the country can still export food to feed 2 million people in British cities. In terms of economy, this is also very important. And to show maybe the development of Ireland run up to the famine, I could talk about Dublin as a case in point and how Ireland really suffers under the active Union. This is Dublin in 1610. Dublin around that point was basically a large town, a population of maybe 10 to 15,000. By 1800, just when the Active Union is passed, Dublin has a population of 200,000. It's bigger than Madrid. It's one of the top 10 biggest cities in Northern Europe at the time. It's bigger than all cities in North America combined. So it's a really major city in terms of European and then Europe and European colonies. Like things that embody this is now Leinster House where the Irish government meet. It was the residence of the Dukes of Leinster. It was built in 1745. This is the Customs House that was completed in the 18th century. In many ways, a bit of a golden age for Dublin. I'm talking in a very general sense. There's huge poverty in the city, but there's huge poverty in every city in the world at this point. Well, today too, but anyway, that's an argument for another day. This is the Four Courts complex finished at the end of the 19th century, or the 18th century. The reason I want to show you these is that Dublin, there's this idea that Ireland is like poverty-ridden society, constantly teetering on the brink. Like Dublin is a city, you get visitors to Dublin who compare it to London at the time. It's a smaller place, but it does have the trappings of a big city. In terms of its economy, up until 1800, there had been a burgeoning kind of industrial sector in Dublin, perhaps best symbolised by the linen industry. Dublin had a huge linen hall built up on the north side of the city in the 18th century. You had the passage or the transport of linen grown in the northeast down to Dublin. This would lead to huge exports. This was processed in Dublin and then exported out. If we talk about then what happens after the Act of Union is passed, let me see where we are. Yes, after the Act of Union is passed, that industrial sector more or less disappears. It collapses, it's exposed to British industry, and it just cannot compete on that level. So basically Ireland, on the eve of the famine, is an agrarian economy. The agrarian economy is dominated by a few thousand landlords, but most of the land is held by a few hundred families. So you've got the butlers of Ormond who live in Kilkenny Castle. They own a lot of Kilkenny and Tipperary. Who are from not too far from here, the Dukes of Devonshire. This is Lismore Castle, the centre of their estates in Waterford. There's also the Marquess of Conyngham, an English landlord who doesn't ever come to Ireland, comes to Ireland twice in his life, but owns 157,000 acres of land in Meath and Donegal. So the nature of land ownership is highly unequal. Now these estates are run to varying degrees. Some are run pretty well. They appoint estate managers that are often sent over from Britain, have a lot of experience at running these estates. They're sent over from Britain to run these estates. Others are managed absolutely disastrously. All they want is rent. So what they do is they rent the land out to middlemen. They in turn rent it out and rent it out and rent it out. You have this real kind of Byzantine system of land ownership with the landlords at the top creaming off the money. In terms of trying to understand, though, this is an agrarian economy that's been developed as such through the 19th century. And there's three ways people earn money. So in the south of the country, you've got a region of Ireland called the Golden Vale. This is where huge crops are grown. I'm going to come back to that. In the east, you have cattle herds, and then in the west, you've kind of got a mixed system and also small tenants. This general situation, though, the way Ireland has been, effectively, its industry has been stopped developing. I wouldn't say it's been deindustrialised, but it's been stopped developing, and benefits Britain for several reasons. So there's no industrial competition for big British industry emerging at this time. That's very important. Ireland is also producing a large pool of young men that would be recruited into the British Army and serve in the British Army and serve in the army of the East India Company, which are being recruited out of Ireland at this point. And perhaps most importantly, this is producing a massive food surplus of, as I've said already, to feed about 2 million people in British cities. Britain is going through the Industrial Revolution at this point, so it needs this food. Again, I'll just return to that point. Ireland is not overpopulated. And the reason I keep bringing this up is that it's often one of the often kind of claimed things about the famine. Now, I need to keep moving here, but to underpin this entire economy, you've got a very unequal society, and this is where the potato comes in. You'll often hear about the potato famine. The reason that the potato is so central in Ireland is that you've got this massively unequal society, a population of 8 to 9 million people. About a third of those people, 3 million people, are dirt poor. The only way they can survive is to eat the potato. The amount of potatoes that Irish people eat on the eve of the famine is absolutely phenomenal. A man would eat 12 to 14 pounds, that's about 6 kilos a day. A woman would eat 10 to 12 kilos, that's 10 to 12 kilos of potatoes there. Or that's 5 kilos, yeah, sorry. That's what a woman would eat every single day, and a child would eat about 2 kilos. Sounds unbelievable. This is attested to time and again in records at the time. Now, this makes Irish people poor, but very healthy compared to British working class people at the time. Recruits to the army of the East India Company from Ireland are about a half an inch taller on average coming from Ireland. It just shows the potato is actually a very healthy diet. So Irish people on the eve of the famine, they're very poor, but comparatively speaking, quite healthy. Generally speaking though, Ireland is in a very precarious position by 1845. This is well known. The famine was not predicted. Sometimes that's claimed, that's not true, but the British government was very aware of the series of problems in Irish society by this massive inequality. The Devon Commission reported to the British government in 1845. This was a several-year kind of report into the problems of Ireland, and they had raised the problems in great detail to the British government, and then suggested this huge raft of reforms that would probably take place over the course of the 19th century to slowly modernise, as they saw it, Ireland at the time. This wasn't done, although, as we're about to see, some of this will be implemented at breakneck speed through the famine, a bit of shock doctrine type scenario. So, I guess to summarise, what we're talking about in Ireland in 1845, and I have spent a good bit of time talking about this, but I don't think you can really appreciate what's about to happen if you don't have a sense of... So Ireland is ruled directly from London. That means the decisions taken about the famine are going to be taken in London. It's a massively unequal society. You can say all societies are unequal. That is true. Ireland doesn't have some of the kind of paternalistic relationships you get between landlord and tenant in other parts of the United Kingdom at the time. This will come into play. Ireland, as I've said now 3 or 4 times, is not overpopulated. You're sick of me saying that. It's an agrarian economy underpinned by this production of potatoes. If they're not being produced, 3 million people have nothing else to eat. And it's an export economy. So the surplus of food that is produced is exported largely to Britain, although some does go to the United States, and we'll explore more. So the Great Famine begins, we're 15 minutes in and we've got to the start of the famine. We'll get there. It begins in September 1845 with the appearance of a fungus called blight that had never been seen in Ireland before. It spreads quite rapidly in the autumn of 1845. The danger this presents is very well known at the time. People can see that this is a huge problem. A new disease appears on a crop that 3 million people are dependent on very quickly. The British government in London recognised this. Politicians in Ireland recognised this. The British government at the time is led by Sir Robert Peel, a man not liked in Ireland. He's a conservative. Daniel O'Connell famously referred to him as Orange Peel for his connections to the Orange Order. He, though, does actually, as British governments go, he acts better than most, but that's not saying anything. He does send a scientific commission to Ireland composed of John Lindley, the man on the right, and Lionel Playfair, the man on the left. They're a botanist and a scientist, and they're sent to Ireland to try and really find out what's happening. because there's this idea that a lot of stuff in Ireland is exaggerated, and that what this report that the potato crop is being destroyed might be exaggerated. They report back in October, and they tell the British government that it's actually way worse than what you've heard. There's going to be a total failure of the potato crop in Ireland. So by this point, they're very aware of what's happening. At the same time, you've got demands coming from Ireland. This is Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell is the most famous Irish politician of the age. A conservative nationalist, had spearheaded a campaign for Catholic emancipation in 1829. He leads something called the Mansion House Committee, a kind of a relief committee, a charitable organisation almost. But they approached the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in Dublin with a series of demands of what they feel should be done. And these demands are, well, I know that. First, the central key thing is an embargo on the export of certain foods from Irish ports, basically corn. They want to stop the export of corn. They want distilleries to be banned from continuing to use grain in distillation because that food could be eaten. They have demands on the British Army garrisons in Ireland that they'll stop using the amount of grain they're using because they have a huge amount of horses. They want that to stop. The British government rejects more or less all of these out of hand. Why they do that, I'm going to come back. Robert Peel does import £100,000 of food in secret into Ireland. The reason they do it in secret is because they're afraid of the free trade lobby, which is becoming very powerful in Ireland and Britain. And they're afraid that merchants will basically start to boycott Irish ports if they know the government is going to interfere directly in the free market. Now, Robert Peel himself does believe in this as well. So you might ask, why are they doing this? And it's a really important aspect of this to understand. These guys are committed to laissez-faire free market economics. They're seen as revolutionary, essentially, at the time in the 1820s, 1830s, and this is going to be their chance to test these ideas out. They fervently believe, though, that a free market solution is going to solve this, or it's the best solution. They have a very racist attitude, though, and a couple of 100,000 paddies die, but that's like the way things work in the world, isn't it? And this is the attitude they go into this with. I suppose the question is, does this work? This is Peel again. They work, but they work for the reasons, not for the reasons they think, and this is actually disastrous. So the crisis in 1845 is not as bad as predicted, 30% failure of the potato crop. The poor in Ireland, often presented as just total victims in this, they struggle to survive, and they're used to hardship, so they pawn everything they have, nets if you're a fisherman, farmer, or tools if you're a farmer, anything you have, so they get money and they can survive through that first year. Savings are used up. The government had actually imported way too little food, but because the crisis is not as bad, they get away with it. Unfortunately, they take all the worst analysis from this. So they believe that their solutions work, they believe that the free market works, and they believe that problems in Ireland are exaggerated. All these things are actually confirmed in this first year in a complete misreading of the situation. It all gets a lot worse if you're... So in 1846, moving the story on, no one dies in that first year of the famine, or almost no one dies. It's generally accepted. The Conservatives are replaced by the Liberals, way worse if you're in Ireland in 1845. This man, Sir Robert Peel, heads up a new Liberal administration. The reason you have a change in government in Britain is the repeal of the Corn Laws, and they'd been kind of artificially keeping the price of grain high to benefit farmers. The reason I bring this up is it's often mentioned that they did this to save the starving Irish. They didn't. There'd been a campaign in Britain for decades to repeal the Corn Laws, and they used the excuse of the famine to do it. These guys take over, and they're absolutely dogmatic about their commitment to free market ideology, economics, laissez-faire politics. They believe the government should intervene in the economy as little as possible. Some of the leading figures in this government are deeply anti-Catholic, and that shapes some of their views as well. And unfortunately, the blight returns much worse and much earlier in 1846. So by July, you've got a widespread appearance of the blight, and the entire crop is lost in the summer of 1846. The entire crop is lost. That's about once you reach an 80% failure, that's considered a total failure. The poor at this point are desperate. They've used up all their resources. If you're from a fishing community in the west of Ireland, say, you've pawned your fishing tackle, nets, things like that, that would allow you to survive. They had no savings, and starvation faces them, or stares them in the face. This new government react slowly and very ideologically. They prorogue Parliament in August and don't meet again until January 1847. I suppose it's an indication of how the lacking of seriousness they take it. The other key figures in this government who are rarely ever mentioned, this is Charles Wood, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was a particularly odious figure, and maybe a more famous person is this man, Charles Edward Trevelyan, often mentioned in Irish, I suppose, culture and things like that, as the kind of evil figure of the famine. He certainly played a terrible role in it. He's actually a civil servant in Britain, often considered in songs, he's often mentioned as a landlord. He's the leading civil servant, but he's a micromanager and exacts huge influence over relief policy in Ireland. In 1846, this basically embodies, this is Trevelyan writing to a man called Edward Pinecoffin in Ireland in 1846, and this embodies the principle by which they're going to tackle the famine and do not encourage the provision of exports. Perfect free trade is the right course. This leads to the export of the harvest in 1846. This is a crucial time in the famine. You end up with they don't import food, so they import less food than the previous year and allow the export of the harvest of 1846 from Irish ports. Now this is done by the protection of the British Army, which is more troops are brought into Ireland. They're not exporting the food, they're protecting convoys of food from farms being sent to ports and exported. This leads particularly to major riots across all the southern ports in Ireland, and several people are killed. And these are, there's often an idea that this is done kind of by people in a desperate, kind of irrational way. If you look at the time, you can see the demands often laid out by these crowds up to 4,000 or 5,000 strong. They'll set out a series of demands about how they want food prices controlled, things like that. These are all put down by the army and the police, and they pursue this policy, as Trevelyan had said, that like perfect free trade is the right course. It's an absolute disaster. No one wants to import food into Ireland in 1846 because no one's going to buy it. What do the poor have to buy? Like, they'll import certain food, but cheap food for the poor is not being imported, and there are shortages all over Europe, so the government needed to intervene in this situation. They didn't. The government do respond by opening a public works scheme because they want the free market to function. So for the free market to function, the poor obviously need food or need money. They set up a public works scheme where they build infrastructure projects such as roads like this one is the Healy Pass in Kerry. It's a very famous road up through the mountains. You find these all over Ireland, roads running to the middle of nowhere. They build harbours. The idea here is that the poor will earn money to buy food. Because of the situation that's been allowed to develop, there's not enough food in the country. And secondly, the wages they're earning on these infrastructure projects aren't enough to feed families. So you end up with hundreds of thousands of people dying in that year of 1847. They do change, in 1846 to 1847. They eventually change in policy in the early months of 1847. They open up soup kitchens. These are notorious in Ireland, but they're actually quite effective. But July 1847, these soup kitchens are feeding about 3 million people, what's called excess mortality, people dying who shouldn't be dying. That is starting to fall back to normal rates. But in a typical British government policy, they shut down all the soup kitchens in August 1847 because they decide, for several reasons, that they always want to get back to this idea of allowing the free market to function. Soup kitchens are not that because they're giving out free food. And they also just want rid of the famine. There's complaints in England at this point that they're spending too much money on famine relief in Ireland. There's rising opposition to this all across Britain at this point, but particularly in the British middle classes, that they're kind of spending money on Irish people who will con their way out of, these Irish people will just take, and if you keep feeding them, they'll just take our taxes, basically the way it's presented. So when these soup kitchens are closed down, the British government more or less washes its hands of the famine. They throw it back onto Irish society. They say that Ireland is going to fund famine relief internally from this point on. The country is more or less economically devastated and collapsed by this point. The entire economy is collapsing. there's just not enough resources in the country to do this. Following on from this is where you start to get the huge levels of emigration. Between 1846 and 1851, about 1 million people emigrate from Ireland. By 1860, 2 million people will have emigrated. By 1900, 2 in every 5 Irish people are living outside the island. This is also the most effective famine relief strategy in the 1840s. If you want to survive, you get out of Ireland. The people who leave Ireland tend to be slightly more affluent people. The poor are stuck in Ireland, trapped in workhouses, and they're the ones who die in huge numbers. Charles Trevelyan, again, he wrote a book called The Irish Crisis in 1848, but to give you a sense, he talks about the history of the Great Irish Famine of 1847 while it's still going on in Ireland. They've just decided it's over. But also, this, in the later years, this next quote gives you a sense of how the British government start to look at this situation in the later years of the famine. And he says, unless we are much deceived, posterity will trace up to that famine the commencement of a salutary revolution in the habits of a nation, long singularly unfortunate, and will acknowledge that this, as on many other occasions, supreme wisdom has educated permanent good out of transient evil. So they see this chance to overhaul Ireland in the depths of this famine. They're going to overhaul the economy, society, and this is going to, as he sees it, permanent good out of transient evil. And this leads and shapes certain other policies that they bring in. So, for example, they bring in something called the quarter-acre clause. You can only go to a workhouse in Ireland from late 1847, after those soup kitchens shut down, if you've less than a quarter acre of land. That if you go to a workhouse with more than that, they'll turn you away. The reason they do this is to force the poor to give up their farms and leave. They also incentivise in this new structure where they're putting all famine relief back onto Irish society. This force, let me rephrase that. It incentivises landlords to evict people because landlords have to pay taxes to fund famine relief on the poorest in Irish society. So if you're a landlord, it benefits you to get the poor off your estates and get them out of your area so you're not having to fund famine relief for these people. The famine drags on, and you'll often see the Great Famine 1846 to 51. 51 is only a year that we use because there was a census done that year. It drags on right into the middle of the 1850s. The crisis changes. After 1847, there's no shortage of food in Ireland. Like most modern famines, food is not the issue. You cannot access food. That's the key issue. The poor have no money, so they can't buy food, and it doesn't matter how cheap it is. But the British government want a food market to function because they've got this commitment to free trade principles, and they're really hesitant. So the famine is prolonged much longer than it needed to be. There are debates over 1846 whether there was going to be something called a starvation gap, and that some people may have died that winter. Certainly, what happens in the later years of the famine is more or less what he's talking about here, this kind of idea of a revolution, an economic revolution going to be implemented in Ireland. The impact of this is devastating. You probably have all heard of 1 million dead, 1 million fled, so 1 million emigrate in the first 5 years and 1 million people starved to death. There's lots of other things that aren't often discussed. The workhouse, these are the evictions. 250,000 people are evicted from their homes because of those policies in the late 1850s or 1840s. Here's a landlord who was shot dead. I put him in just to lighten up the mood. He was shot dead in November 1847 by tenants on his estate in Strokestown. A depiction of Moveen and Clare after evictions have taken place because they're clearing the land. They pull down the houses. They don't just evict people. Queen Victoria does come to Ireland in 1849, and that's a sense that things are easing. Her visit to Ireland is stage managed. She visits Cork, sails around the coast to Dublin. It's a very carefully choreographed. She doesn't go to the west of Ireland because if she'd gone to the west of Ireland, she would have seen a lot of starving people and literally people falling down dead. So this is very carefully choreographed, and she comes, her visit kind of pronounces to the world that the famine is over. It's far from it. I just want to throw in a couple of things that people don't think about the famine in terms of its impact. In 1851, there was 90,000 unaccompanied children in Irish workhouses. They're orphans whose families had died. there's a mental health crisis. We don't ever think about that, and it wasn't seen as such in the 19th century. But this is from the 1870s, from the report of the inspectors of asylums in Ireland, and it says it seems probable that children born and partially reared amidst the horrors of the famine and the epidemics of disease that followed it were so handicapped in their nervous equipment as to be weak-minded from the start or to fall victim to mental disease later. It's a very 19th century way of talking about a mental health crisis, but it's not surprising given you're talking about 90,000 kids in workhouses who are orphaned, and a lot of them will remain in workhouses for the following decade, institutionalised from the youngest years. Workhouses are also, they're harsh regimes where people aren't fed well, but they're rife with abuse of all kinds as well. It's not surprising that late 19th century Ireland has a mental health crisis. I kind of feel I should cut to what the title of this talk is, because I'm going to be running out of time and I want to leave some time for questions. But the question is, what does all this constitute? So is it a famine or is it a genocide? And it's worth saying the argument that it was a genocide was articulated as early as the 1840s and 1850s by Irish nationalists. However, it has only really gained the traction it has recently since the 1990s, and it's generally pushed out of Irish America. It's worth saying pretty much, actually all Irish historians say the famine was not a genocide, that it was a famine, but I want to come back to that because we often don't understand our public discourse and debate about what a famine is. If you hear of a famine anywhere, it's not happening for natural causes. There hasn't been a natural famine for maybe 500-600 years. You did get them in the Middle Ages where there was just no food and there wasn't enough food for people to survive. All famines. What happens in Ireland, what happens in India through the late 19th century is very similar to what happens in Ireland. They are, I suppose I want to be kind of clear about this. I'm not, when I say, I don't think it was a genocide, I think it was a famine. From my mind, that doesn't in any way lessen what the British government are responsible for in Ireland. But if you call it a genocide, I think we ask the wrong questions and we don't get the full picture of what's happening. Because if you look at their motivation in terms of reorganising the Irish economy, the goal there wasn't necessarily to get rid of the Irish people. They wanted the economy to function differently. So also, if you look at the export of food, that's a really key aspect of this. In the winter of 1846 to 1847, about 500,000 Irish farmers and merchants are also involved in that, and to a degree profiting from it. Irish landlords are also involved in the famine, and there can be a tendency to kind of distance or strip those people of Irish identity. They are Irish. If you want to understand the famine, it's more about class than anything else. Like that's really, you can see it. Marx gets it half right and half wrong in a lot of things. But he said the Irish famine of 1846 killed more than 1 million people, but it killed poor devils only. He's right there. To the wealth of the country, it did not the slightest damage. That's not quite true, but look, it's an argument for another day. Maybe to finish up, and I do want to leave time for questions, to come back to the man we started with, Nassau Senior, very influential British economist, ideologue in the 19th century. And he said, in the later 19th century, after the famine, experiments are made in that country on so large a scale and pushed to their extreme consequences with such disregard to the sufferings which they inflict. And what he's talking about here is, I suppose, the way Naomi Klein talked about shock doctrine. They forced through these massive economic changes at breakneck speed, even though their own report in 1845 warned them not, that I mentioned it earlier, that report into Irish agriculture, warned that the changes that Ireland needed would take decades, and it had to be done very slowly. And they push it through in the series, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. They do this again and again and again in India. India has a series of terrible famines in the later 19th century. Many of them are very, very similar to what happens in Ireland. Charles Trevelyan famously wrote to a British newspaper in the 1880s during another Indian famine, suggesting that they used the model of Ireland to resolve that famine in the 1880s. So these people are in no way remorseful for what happened. But again, I suppose if we come back to that question, if we call it a genocide, we can look and see what's going on, say, today in Palestine, and we can see a genocide playing out there. And I think what happens in Ireland in the 1840s is absolutely horrific, but it's a different type of policy from a government. And I think, for me, this is important because often we reduce all language to rush to what we think is the most extreme word, the most, to articulate our anger at something. But I'm not sure that always necessarily helps us understand. Like, Tony Blair is many things. He's an awful person responsible for the deaths of a million people, but he's probably not a fascist. And you don't have to be. And in the same way, I suppose I would go, to kill a million people in such a small period of time, you don't need, that is not always a genocide. In Ireland, it was a famine, but that's a British policy implemented in Ireland at the time. There may have been a hungry gap in the later months of 1846, where a certain amount of people may have perished because there simply at that point, due to policies, wasn't enough food in the country. After 1847, Ireland is awash with cheap food and people continue to die. And the reason they continue to die is because they can't access the food that's available because they can't afford it. And I suppose that maybe cuts to the heart of the famine in the 1840s. And I suppose that's what I'm arguing. You might think it's semantics to say, genocide or famine, but I do think it's important because if we ask questions, if we approach something, it will shape the outcome. And I think sometimes this conversation can be predetermined by saying it's a genocide and discounting lots of the complexity and class politics of it in the 1840s. I'm going to stop there. I had a lot more to say, but I have to kind of cut through it. But if anyone has any questions, I can try and answer them.
So I'll now take questions. Who's the hands first up? I think it was your man at the back there. So I think it was you, and then yourself, and we'll move on from there. Ready to go?
Yeah. My Irish ancestry arrived in Bristol about 1865. He would have been a child during the famine. About 5,000 left because it was more profitable for landowners to turn land from arable to pasture because like cattle, pigs and sheep were more profitable for the landowners than it was to grow crops to sort of feed people. Plus I think a lot of Irish crops were exported to feed livestock in the UK, in England as well. You think that had any role in the famine?
The change in agriculture?
Yeah,
like that is starting to happen in Ireland. It had been happening, it started to change the system of agriculture, particularly in the east of the country. And that is a drive of what landlords want, but it's not, the famine can't be stripped down to one single policy. There's a series of things, and in certain estates, that is definitely it. They want to get people out and cattle in, or sometimes sheep in, if it's in the west of Ireland, the cattle can't thrive there. But that's not always the case either. But it is a dynamic that's underway that had kind of been starting since like the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Yourself?
I think it was yourself.
Yeah. I think that point you've got on the board is actually very good because if you read Mike Davies' late Victorian Holocaust, this wasn't an isolated occurrence. This is an example you could use for India, China, parts of Africa, all around the world. Not just Britain actually, but in most cases it was mainly Britain. And you talk about class, and that's very true. But I think it's the system, is the pursuit of money, accumulation of capital. That's what the thing was about, more than just vindictiveness against Irish. That the scapegoating we see now in all around the world, and we've got elections coming up in Britain, where the scapegoats are not Irish, they're immigrants, but scapegoating is always used an excuse. You mentioned right at the beginning about Irish were portrayed as something different, backward, and all that sort of stuff. That's scapegoating, and it's scapegoating, but it's the system that we live in and we lived in then, with colonialism and imperialism. And I think we have to look wider than just the Irish famine or genocide. It is what we live in at different periods of time that's going on everywhere. And in modern day, it's going on in Palestine and other places around the world. It's the system we have to look at. It's a class system, the pursuit of profits and accumulating the Musks of this world banding their money around in, you know, wherever they can, and the consequences of paying what in Ireland and in India and everywhere else.
Something I've never really understood, probably a complicated question. By the time of the famine, the peasantry, most of England and Wales have gone. They've been removed by the enclosures. You know, 60 BC now, basically. Were the enclosures, was that process underway in Ireland before the famine?
Yeah.
But it was late.
Yeah, like the reasons you have, so in the agricultural areas, the areas that grow large amounts of crops in the south of the country, they're quite late, that's labour intensive work, so they need large amounts of labour to come in every year, and that's why landlords are quite happy to keep large pools of poor. In the west of Ireland, the farming system is very different, it's very small farms. So like you get like 5 to 10, 15 acre farms, as opposed to in the east where you've got these huge tracts. In the east of the country, people, it's an awful kind of, are being pushed really to the margins, but by big cattle ranches, and they're not very labour intensive at all. So you get, but basically there's different things. Again, it can't be. I don't want to say yes, that's it, because it depends on where you are in Ireland.
Why don't you think that the genocide led to revolution as like the famines that were happening in Europe at a similar time did?
There is a rebellion in Ireland in 1848. It's not really, though, the people who are involved in that rebellion aren't really the starving poor. By 1848, like people in the west of Ireland can't eat, like politics is not on the agenda, like they're trying to find very basic things in terms of eating. Famines, though, you get like the food shortages you get in the hungry 40s in Europe are nothing on the scale of what you get in Ireland in the late 1840s, and it actually, a lot of the political debate is around the national question and our link to Britain, and obviously that is related to this, but for a lot of the poor, like they're in a daily struggle to eat, and like they're too hungry to fight.
Right, I think we have time for about a few more questions for 1, 2, 3, I think, and there's another 2. If you can manage to speak a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Was there any official support for getting rid of the population by exporting them to other countries?
Like, there are, like the big government commission in 1845 recommends that the Irish countryside does need, like the assisted emigration needs to be introduced, and they advocate that it would happen over decades. Some landlords do pay for their tenants. That guy actually was shot, who I show you, he actually had paid for his tenants to go to on one-way tickets to the US, or to Canada rather in his case. Half the people died because he cut the costs of doing it. Others are kind of more efficient. They pay for passage, but the reasons they're doing it is to get people out of the country because someone in America can't attack you in Ireland. There is land clearances, yes. There's definitely a policy of clearing certain parts. It varies though massively from place to place, and it varies from landlord to landlord, and it varies from county to county. But definitely land clearance is part of, like when they reference like, you know, 1 million people have died and scarcely do no good, that is part of what they're talking about. So.
When you look at it from an academic point of view, I understand why it might not be a genocide, it might be a famine. But if you think about a working class or a non-powerful experience of people who are victimised because you're from that family or culture, like for example in Aboriginal Australia, some versions of what happened over 100 years of European occupation can start to look like a famine from a cultural point of view, from a class point of view, from a community point of view. And do you think from that perspective, and I say that as a person who, my dad's from Kerry and my mum's from the border, and we come from very, very poor small farms, and also did for many hundreds of So when we talk about it as a community or as a family, it looks a lot more like a genocide.
Yeah, like,
Does that make sense?
no, it does. I think part of the problem is that we view famines as natural events. And I think some of this is because this stuff is happening year in, and it's happened every single year since this happened. Happens today, and it actually, to a certain degree, probably influences the price of food that we eat. It's a very, very... It makes life easier if we talk about famines being natural and things that happen over there and in the past, and they're not really... Do you know what I mean? Like, as opposed to these essentially engineered situations where food is either not moved to areas that need it or is exported from those areas. Like, you know, another example, I guess, is the removal of food from Bengal in 1943 because the British Army fell for various different reasons, and Churchill wanted to remove that food from Bengal in case of the fall into the hands of the Japanese, and a series of other reasons. I think, I suppose, from looking at it, I think famine explains it better, but not if we assume that famine is some sort of natural phenomenon. It's not, and that's not what's happening. But if you want to go down, you know, if we were to take it, if people interpret that as, oh, this is just a natural crisis, then I would actually almost support your argument in that. But I think what it needs to be is that we need to understand what famine is, because I think all this has actually quite big implications today, because famine is not a thing in the past, no matter what Bono might say. But, you know, like, this stuff goes on and it influences the price of foods that we eat. And I'm not sure a genocide argument fully explains that. And it also, genocide can break down the class dynamic of it as well. And kind of, it was often an argument in many ways. You know, like, there was a glossing over of the history of the famine in Ireland by wealthier Irish nationalists who didn't want to talk about what their ancestors had done or how they had survived, and, you know, and things like that. And I think famine does help us interrogate that, because if you're looking for genocide arguments, I think that I think it's more simplistic, and I think what happened in Ireland in the 1840s is very complex, and I think famine argument helps us parse that apart. You know, I do understand what you're saying, though. Like, from an academic point of view, it can be, and it can ring hollow then. But I think maybe it's about understanding and trying to get across what a famine is and was.
Can you just take this fella?
Yeah. Yeah.
Curious about why Ireland was so reliant on potatoes, which came from South America.
Yeah.
And you said corn as well. And a single flight obviously will then wipe out a lot of the crops. And so is there interplay between the system there?
So they were introduced into Ireland in the 16th century, but they really only take off in the 18th century. And they partly take off because as the Irish economy is kind of being commercialised, it allows the poor to occupy smaller and smaller parts of land, and actually worse land. So it suits the kind of commercialised economy that's being developed. So landlords are introducing them into the estates and things like that, and they're very healthy compared to like what you would eat in a Victorian city, which is bread and tea or bread and water. You know, it's actually much healthier than that. I don't know if that answers the question.
We've just got room for one more question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
First up at the beginning.
I really enjoy your podcast
Oh, thanks.
and getting in the gaps in what we were taught in schools here about history of Ireland. And I'm just wondering how much of what you've told us is kind of part of the curriculum in Ireland.
The famine is definitely taught. It's not maybe as central as, like, in my mind, the famine is the most important event in modern Irish history, far more important than the revolution. In many ways, the revolution actually only is the outworking of some of the stuff that really starts to build up and crystallise after this. It explains a lot of things like land ownership, attitudes to land ownership in Ireland. So it is taught, but maybe not given the importance it is. There is also just the passage of time. It's nearly 200 years now, and there's just an inevitability. Now, it has left a huge impact on the country that I think is outweighed. You know, there's been nothing like it, you know, to you know, cover over that chapter in our history. But it's not. A big problem was it wasn't discussed by academic historians. There's an often said that it's not discussed in Ireland. I don't really buy that. If you look at folklore and stuff, it was discussed, it's mentioned. You know, things that mention the famine, like songs, books like, say, Trinity by Leon Uris or Famine by Liam O'Flaherty, all became bestsellers. So Irish people were very much open to it, but you didn't actually get any histories of it. The first one was written in 1879, and then an English woman, Cecil Woodham Smith, wrote The Great Hunger in 1960 or 57 or 62, and that was really the first accessible history, and there wouldn't be another one really written throughout the Troubles. There's a lot of economic history done, very, very important, but really inaccessible. So well, it was and it wasn't discussed. There wasn't, if you wanted to find out before the 90s, if you wanted to read like narrative histories that would explain just roughly what happened, like you were dependent on 2 or 3 books, and academics just weren't interested, and they've said it. Like Mary Daly, an Irish historian, has said that you didn't do it because it was politically kind of not the thing to do during the Troubles, which is, like, that's not the job of a historian. Like, they used to talk about writing provisional history, in reference to the provost, but like, that's not a historian shouldn't be concerned with, like, if the British government did it, that's their business, and but Irish historians were muted by that and silenced themselves. It's a very strange phenomenon, and it was actually historians in England of Irish descent who really broke that, like people like Christine Keneally and actually Terry Eagleton and people like that.
Okay, thanks everybody.